I pulled into the valet at the Four Seasons Palm Beach, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the marble driveway, and I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. As I handed my keys to the young attendant, he glanced at me with a barely concealed smirk and muttered, "Sir, your table isn't ready yet." I nodded politely, swallowing the lump in my throat, and asked quietly, "Could you tell me where I'm supposed to sit?" He hesitated, then pointed toward the far end of the grand ballroom, where laughter already echoed. I walked in, feeling the weight of every eye on me, every whisper like a pinprick against my skin. The decorations gleamed, gold and crystal reflecting off polished floors, but I felt nothing but isolation. A woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Oh, look at him. He must be the old man they had to invite." My chest tightened. I forced a smile, trying to maintain calm, and muttered under my breath, "I've earned my place here." Michael passed by, glanced at me without a word, and that silence stung worse than any insult. I approached the assigned seat and froze. The name card read, "Obligatory, old man." A sharp, collective laugh erupted from Victoria's family, the Langfords, echoing through the hall, the kind of laughter that digs into your very core. "Oh, Dad, it's just a joke," Michael whispered, his eyes darting away from mine, unable to meet my gaze. I nodded, pretending amusement I didn't feel, my fingers tightening around the chair's back. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to demand respect, but I didn't. I sat quietly, feeling the sting of betrayal and humiliation. "Only if this story truly resonates with you," I said softly to the camera. "Please hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city or country." My name is Richard Harrison. I'm 74, and this was the night that changed everything in my family. And the real lesson you're going to take from this video? Stay until the end to see it unfold. And now let me tell you how it all began. As I looked around, the crystal chandeliers reflected the smug faces of Victoria's family, Edward's smug grin, Patricia's raised eyebrow, and a million silent accusations in the air. I could hear snippets of their conversation. "After tonight, he won't have a say in anything." The words were meant to cut, to humiliate, but I kept my voice low. "I'm here for my son. Nothing else matters." Edward's laugh boomed over the orchestra playing in the background. "Well, he certainly looks the part of the obligatory guest." Patricia leaned in, whispering so only Victoria could hear, "Do you really think he deserves to be here?" Victoria smiled, confident, unaware that I had kept many secrets, silent for decades, but not powerless. Michael's eyes flicked to mine again, and I saw a glimmer of doubt, confusion, and a hint of guilt. I settled into my chair, the laughter still echoing, feeling a storm building silently inside me. Nobody yet knew the truths I held about the fortunes, the deals, the hidden structures that could change everything by morning. And as the toast began, raising glasses to new beginnings, I felt the first stirrings of the plan I would set in motion, a plan that would unravel the smug certainty of the Langford Empire before anyone realized what hit them. As I sat quietly at the far end of the grand ballroom, my mind drifted back to my own childhood in a small town outside of Chicago, where I had learned early on what it meant to be overlooked. My father had been a stern man, always praising my younger brother for accomplishments I had worked just as hard for, and I could still remember the sting when he had said, "Richard, you just do not have the knack for this." I had tried to please, to earn his recognition, but it was never enough. My mother, gentle but weary, had whispered at the dinner table, "You are capable, Richard, but sometimes people do not see what is true." That lesson in invisibility stayed with me, shaping a quiet resolve that carried me through life. In this ballroom, surrounded by the glitter of wealth and the prideful laughter of Edward Langford, I could feel the echo of those old wounds pressing against my chest. I remembered sitting at my parents' long dining table, feeling like an outsider even in my own home, and now here I was again, seated at a table where I was treated as a token presence, a necessary formality rather than a valued guest. Michael passed by, balancing his glass of champagne, and leaned down slightly, his voice low. "Dad, perhaps you should just enjoy the view from here." I managed a nod, my fingers brushing against the embroidered edge of the tablecloth, feeling the texture almost grounding me. The servers moved gracefully, Yet the eyes of the Langfords followed me with a mixture of curiosity and condescension, a subtle reminder that I was being judged from every angle. My thoughts returned to Victoria, poised elegantly in her gown, laughing softly at something whispered to her by her mother. I caught a glimpse of her smile, confident, perhaps unaware that the power dynamics of the room were far more complex than she realized. I whispered to myself, I have learned to wait, to watch, to understand the currents before I move. As I traced the pattern of the crystal chandelier above, I recalled the small injustices in my own household as Michael was growing up, how tiny slights could build into resentment, how favoritism could skew perception and plant seeds of arrogance. Richard, are you sure you will be all right here? Thomas had asked earlier over the phone, his voice warm but tinged with concern. I had replied simply, I have been overlooked before. I can handle it. And in that quiet, measured way, I felt the old lessons intertwining with the present moment, recognizing the subtleties of power, the gestures that mattered more than words. I glanced at the towering floral arrangements, each stem placed with precision, a metaphor of control, and I thought of how easily appearances could deceive. My own past had taught me to read between the lines, to note the unspoken, to understand where influence truly lay. As a server quietly set a glass of sparkling water before me, I caught Edward's eye and held it briefly, the weight of silent knowledge passing between us, though he did not yet comprehend it. Michael, adjusting his cufflinks, looked distracted, a hint of uncertainty in his expression, yet he did not challenge the dynamics, unaware that history often repeats until someone intervenes. Patricia whispered something to Victoria, a comment that drew a ripple of laughter, and I felt the familiar tug of injustice, a recognition that some patterns of behavior remained unchanged across generations. I leaned back slightly, taking in the room, and allowed myself a small, controlled exhale, letting the calm settle over the simmering tension. In that moment, I knew the events unfolding in the ballroom were only the surface of a much larger story, a story shaped by bias, by oversight, by the invisible currents of family and expectation. And as the orchestra began a gentle waltz in the background, I felt a subtle shift, a stirring that hinted at change, at the possibility that the quiet patience I had cultivated over decades might soon converge with opportunity. Something unseen was at play, and I could feel it brushing against the edges of the gathering, promising a revelation that would ripple far beyond this room. And I knew that what had begun as mere observation was about to become the first move in a series of events that could redefine everything. The tension settled like a low hum in the air, a prelude to the unveiling of truths long hidden, and I realized that the first step toward reclaiming dignity and respect was simply to remain present, fully aware, and ready to act when the moment arrived. The soft clinking of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the ballroom, but I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the room itself had noticed something change. A young cousin of Victoria's leaned closer and whispered, "Do you think he knows something we do not?" I did not respond, following my old habit of listening first, of measuring before reacting, letting the uncertainty ripple around me without revealing a flicker of emotion. Michael passed by, his face taut, and muttered under his breath, "Dad, maybe you should relax. You do not need to sit here feeling awkward." I nodded, allowing the calm to mask the storm inside, while my eyes caught Patricia Langford adjusting the centerpiece flowers with meticulous care, her glance flicking briefly in my direction, betraying a hint of curiosity that she did not yet understand. Across the hall, Edward was engaged in a conversation with one of his business associates, speaking confidently about a new investment, unaware that I had quietly secured the leverage that would soon shift the balance entirely. I allowed myself a small smile, imperceptible to most, acknowledging that patience was already beginning to reward me. The subtle signs of attention, the sideways glances, the slight hesitation in conversations that had previously flowed unchallenged, suggested the currents were moving differently. I caught Victoria's eye for a fleeting second, her composed expression momentarily faltering, as if she sensed that the person she had underestimated might not be as inconsequential as she had assumed. Thomas's earlier advice echoed in my mind, reminding me that quiet observation was often more powerful than immediate reaction, and I felt a renewed confidence in the silent influence I had maintained for decades. A server approached with a glass of sparkling water, and Edward waved dismissively, turning to comment to his associate, "Do not mind the old man. He will not affect anything here." I allowed my lips to curve ever so slightly, knowing that the very statement was a signal to me that the recognition of potential in the seemingly powerless was beginning to settle in their consciousness. Michael leaned down, whispering again, "Dad, it looks like they are paying more attention to you than you realize." I nodded, replying softly, "Let them watch, Michael. Watching can teach more than speaking." In that moment, the previously unnoticed corners of the room became stages for subtle influence, as eyes that had glided past me before now hesitated, recalibrating to account for a presence they had not understood. I felt a quiet thrill, a confirmation that what I had learned in my youth, the patience of endurance, the power of observation, was beginning to bear fruit in a setting I had long thought purely ceremonial. The orchestra shifted into a delicate interlude, and Edward's voice wavered slightly as he discussed schedules and assets, unaware that one small, discreet move I had made earlier had already begun to redirect certain decisions in my favor. Patricia glanced at me again, her curiosity now tinged with apprehension, and I realized that subtle shifts in perception were forming, creating a space where my next steps could carry more weight than anyone anticipated. Victoria adjusted her gown, her poised smile faltering for a heartbeat as she caught a glimpse of a look between Michael and me, the unspoken understanding hinting at the growing awareness of my influence. The atmosphere was charged with silent possibilities, the kind that could tip an event from ordinary into transformative, and I felt the familiar surge of anticipation, that moment when careful preparation meets opportunity. Every glance, every casual comment, every shadowed whisper contributed to the momentum I had cultivated, and as the strings section of the orchestra swelled, I knew that the first true acknowledgement of my presence had arrived, subtle yet undeniable. And then, across the room, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible hesitation in Edward's posture, a ripple of uncertainty that suggested that the first cracks of realization were forming, hinting at consequences yet unseen, a prelude to a revelation that would soon unfold and shift everything in ways the Langfords had not predicted. As the evening progressed, the warm glow of the chandeliers revealed subtle shifts in the room that most people would have overlooked, but I noticed everything. The sideways glances, the whispered phrases that hung in the air, and the carefully constructed smiles that masked intention. Victoria leaned toward her mother, Patricia, her voice low and measured. "We must ensure that the old man does not interfere. Everything is in place." Patricia nodded, her eyes scanning the guests as if confirming that the narrative she had orchestrated was being accepted as truth. I sipped my water, feeling a pang of betrayal, as I realized how meticulously they had spun a web around me. And yet, no one suspected the quiet awareness behind my calm demeanor. Michael, seated nearby, appeared torn, his brow furrowed as he whispered under his breath, "Dad, they are bending the story against you. They really have everyone fooled." I did not answer. My silence was deliberate, a shield honed over decades of navigating family dynamics and professional schemes. Edward approached the center of the room, engaging the board members and extended family with confident declarations, manipulating perceptions, and reinforcing the narrative that I was merely an ornamental figure, powerless to affect outcomes. I allowed the facade to wash over me, noting each lie, each manipulation, each carefully timed half-truth that they propagated so convincingly that it had begun to dictate behavior and expectations around me. A cousin leaned over to Victoria and murmured, "Everything they said about him seems so convincing. He really appears powerless." Her laughter, though soft, carried the weight of validation, and I felt the sting of deceit, knowing the painstaking care they had taken to make the falsehoods believable. I glanced at Michael again, catching the hesitation in his eyes, the momentary doubt, and I understood that the betrayal was not complete. His awareness lingered, fragile but present. Across the room, a server paused, waiting for instructions, and I noticed Edward subtly redirecting attention from my table, framing decisions in a way that isolated me further from influence. I leaned back slightly, hiding the tightening in my chest, silently cataloging each deceit, recognizing the pattern, and allowing the weight of understanding to settle before acting. Victoria's smile faltered for a heartbeat as she noticed me observing, and I could see the flicker of unease pass through her confidence. Still, the narrative they had spun held sway over the room, convincing even the keenest observers of my supposed insignificance. I thought of past instances when truth had been overshadowed by perception, when effort and integrity were disregarded in favor of superficial appearances, and I understood that tonight was another layer of the same story. But this time, the stage was set for a reversal. As the champagne flowed and the toasts began, the lies propagated themselves further, each word and gesture reinforcing a distorted reality, and I felt the emotional shock settle deep in my chest, the betrayal of intention, trust, and family bonds twisting like a silent knot. Michael finally leaned toward me, voice tight. "Dad, they have everyone believing the story they want. It is so precise, it feels like a trap." I nodded subtly, acknowledging the gravity of the moment without revealing my next move, my silence a testament to the patience that had carried me through decades of subtle power plays. Then, as Edward raised a glass and smiled broadly, I caught the fleeting glimmer of a misstep, a small inconsistency in the web of lies that no one else had noticed, a crack that promised that the carefully constructed illusion was more fragile than they believed. And in that precise instant, I understood that the collapse was imminent, that the narrative they had controlled with such confidence was poised to unravel, and the truth, long hidden and meticulously preserved, was ready to emerge in ways that would astonish everyone in that glittering ballroom. The following morning, I sat in my hotel room, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence, staring at my phone as the unanswered calls and unopened messages piled up like heavy stones on my chest. Each attempt to reach Michael felt like throwing a line into a stormy sea that refused to respond. I had drafted carefully worded emails, each one a plea for clarity, a reminder of trust, and a subtle attempt to remind him of the values we had shared. But each time the message remained unread, the little blue check marks mocking me in their stillness. I picked up the hotel room phone and dialed the office. The line rang and rang before the receptionist finally said, "Mr. Harrison, he is unavailable." I pressed further, leaving voice messages, each one a careful construction of concern and guidance, hoping to reach him before the situation spun entirely out of control. Hours passed, and I tried text messages, each punctuated with clarity and reason, yet I received nothing but silence in return. I remembered a particular note I had left on the kitchen counter at home, a handwritten letter for Michael to read after the ceremony, a simple reflection on family, integrity, and shared history, yet now I feared it would sit among the forgotten and discarded, unnoticed by the very person it was meant to guide. The weight of systemic disregard pressed upon me. It was not a single insult, a single slight, but a coordinated dismissal, a chain of neglect and misunderstanding that had allowed the lies and manipulations of others to dominate. Victoria had succeeded in her subtle campaign, ensuring that every effort I made was thwarted, the room of power I had once influenced now seemingly beyond my reach. I could hear faint laughter from the ballroom below as preparations for the next reception event continued, and I felt the sting of isolation deepen, a reminder that despite my decades of experience and the careful maintenance of relationships and authority, I was now sidelined in a world that had once seemed malleable to my guidance. Michael finally called back in the late afternoon, his voice tight with tension. "Dad, I do not know what to say. Everything has moved so quickly and I cannot undo what has happened." I took a slow breath, controlling the emotion that threatened to rise. "Michael, we need to step back and assess what is true and what has been orchestrated. But we must do it calmly." He hesitated, the pause long and full of unspoken acknowledgement of the complex web he had been caught in. I followed up with a series of emails detailing the evidence of decisions made under pressure, documents attached showing contracts and communications that illustrated the manipulation, yet each email seemed to vanish into the void, unopened or ignored, further emphasizing the systemic collapse of support. Patricia sent a brief note, delicate in tone but clear in implication. "Perhaps it is better to let events unfold naturally," which I interpreted as a subtle dismissal, an attempt to solidify the misdirection. Edward's shadow loomed in the background, omnipresent in phone calls with advisors, reinforcing the narrative I had tried to counter. And yet, I did not react rashly. I cataloged, I observed, I waited, adhering to the principles that had carried me thus far. By evening, the cumulative effect of these failures left me in a profound solitude, a cage of emotional isolation where every effort to reclaim influence had met only resistance or silence. I walked to the balcony, the ocean stretching endlessly under the fading sun, and felt the sharp edge of detachment, the understanding that the house of manipulation had temporarily succeeded in isolating me. Yet in the quiet, I sensed the tiniest flicker of opportunity, a moment poised on the brink of revelation, and I knew that the next move, when it came, would need to be precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. That night, after the last unanswered message and the final failed attempt to reach my son, I sat alone in the hotel room and stared at the photograph I always carried in my wallet. It was a picture of Susan and me standing on a wooden dock in Naples nearly 20 years earlier. The sun was setting behind us, and Michael, barely in his 20s then, was laughing in the background with a fishing rod in his hands. I ran my thumb across the worn edges of the photograph and felt the familiar ache return. Susan had been gone for 7 years, yet some nights the loss still felt fresh enough to stop time. "What would you tell me right now?" I whispered into the empty room. Of course, there was no answer. Only silence. The kind of silence that becomes a companion when enough people stop listening. I walked onto the balcony and looked at the Atlantic Ocean. The waves rolled steadily toward shore, indifferent to weddings, family conflicts, or wounded pride. For the first time in years, I admitted something to myself that I had avoided for far too long. The real pain was not what had happened in the ballroom. The real pain was realizing how long I had been trying to earn a place in rooms where I should have already belonged. I remembered the years after Susan died. Holidays became smaller. Phone calls became shorter. Invitations became less frequent. At first, I made excuses for everyone. People were busy. Families grew. Lives changed. But standing there above the dark water, I finally recognized a truth I had spent years avoiding. I had slowly become a convenience rather than a priority in the lives of people I loved. The realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. My phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Thomas. "Richard, I was about to call again. How are you holding up?" I leaned against the railing. "Honestly, I think I finally understand something." "What is that?" he asked. I kept believing that if I stayed patient long enough, everyone would eventually see the truth. But patience is not the same thing as surrender. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like Susan talking." I smiled despite myself. "Maybe it is." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. He listened more than he spoke. Sometimes that is the greatest gift another person can offer. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. "Richard, do not confuse loneliness with worthlessness. They are not the same thing." After the call ended, I sat in the darkness and let those words settle. Around midnight, I opened an old email folder on my laptop. Hundreds of messages appeared. Years of conversations. Family updates. Business correspondence. Notes Susan had sent before she passed away. One message caught my attention. It was from nearly 11 years earlier. The subject line read, "Important ownership structure." My heartbeat slowed. I opened it. Attached was a document I had not reviewed in years. As I read through the pages, memories returned with startling clarity. Meetings, agreements, decisions made long ago to protect the future of the people I loved. I had nearly forgotten how much responsibility I still carried. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen. Then I began reading every page carefully, not with anger, not with revenge in mind, with understanding. The pieces that had seemed disconnected during the past 24 hours suddenly started fitting together. Victoria's confidence, Edward's assumptions, the pressure surrounding Michael. Certain conversations now made far more sense. By 2 a.m, the crushing loneliness that had followed me throughout the day had not disappeared, but something else had appeared beside it. Awareness. For the first time since arriving in Palm Beach, I no longer felt trapped inside someone else's story. I closed the laptop and looked out toward the dark horizon. The ocean remained calm. Somewhere beyond the darkness, morning was coming. And for the first time all weekend, I found myself believing that when the sun rose, I would not spend another day reacting to what others had decided about me. I would finally begin acting on what they still did not know. I woke before sunrise and drove north along the coast while most of Palm Beach was still asleep. The roads were nearly empty, and for the first time in days, my mind felt clear. I stopped at a small waterfront diner I used to visit years ago during business trips. The waitress looked familiar. After studying my face for a moment, she smiled. "Richard Harrison?" I laughed softly. "I am surprised anyone still remembers me." She poured coffee into my mug. "People remember how you treated them. That lasts longer than money." Those words stayed with me as I sat by the window watching fishing boats leave the harbor. Back at the hotel, I opened my laptop and began working. Not because anyone expected me to. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I finally remembered who I had been before I spent years shrinking myself to keep other people comfortable. The ownership documents I had reviewed during the night led to other files. Those files led to archived agreements. By mid-morning, my desk was covered with notes, timelines, and legal records. I called an attorney I had trusted for over 30 years. "Frank, I need a full review." He immediately recognized the seriousness in my voice. "How fast?" "Today. Then I will clear my schedule." There was no dramatic speech. No emotional outburst. Just work. The kind of work I had built my entire life on. Around noon, Thomas called. "You sound different." I looked out the hotel window. I finally stopped waiting for someone else to solve this. He laughed. "There is the Richard Harrison I remember." Throughout the afternoon, documents moved between offices. Old contacts returned calls within minutes. A retired banker in Atlanta. A legal consultant in Dallas. An accountant in Tampa. People I had helped years ago. People who remembered. Not one of them asked what they would gain. They simply asked, "What do you need?" It struck me then how different real relationships were from transactional ones. Family had gone silent. Yet people I had not spoken with in years were stepping forward without hesitation. By late afternoon, Frank arrived at the hotel carrying a thick folder. He placed it on the table and adjusted his glasses. "Richard, before I explain this, answer one question." "Go ahead. Did anyone tell you what you still control?" I slowly shook my head. Frank smiled. "Then they made a very expensive mistake." For the next hour, we reviewed structures, trusts, ownership rights, and contingency clauses established years earlier. None of it had seemed important while Susan was alive. We had built those protections together because she always believed that emotions could cloud judgment during difficult times. "Plan for the day when people forget who they are," she used to say. As I listened to Frank explain the details, I could almost hear her voice again. Every page revealed another layer of security, another safeguard, another decision made long ago that now carried enormous significance. Meanwhile, life continued around me. The wedding celebrations moved into another day of parties and social events. Social media filled with smiling photographs, expensive dresses, luxury cars, perfect smiles. Yet behind those carefully staged images, I could now see vulnerabilities that no one else recognized. That evening, I walked along the beach as the sun dipped toward the horizon. My phone remained mostly silent. No messages from Michael. No apology. No explanation. Strangely, it no longer mattered as much as it had 24 hours earlier. Something inside me had shifted. I was no longer measuring my worth by who called or who ignored me. I was rebuilding something more important than influence. I was rebuilding certainty. As darkness settled over the water, a new email arrived from Frank. Attached was a finalized report. I opened it immediately. Halfway through the first page, I stopped walking. My heart did not race. Instead, a calm smile slowly crossed my face. For the first time, I could see exactly how the next chapter would unfold. And if the numbers in that report were correct, the people who believed the future belonged entirely to them were about to discover that the real story had only just begun. By mid-morning, I arrived at the downtown office I had not stepped into in nearly a decade, the familiar scent of polished wood and leather greeting me like an old friend. My suit felt impeccable, tailored to the precise measurements I had maintained over the years, and the subtle weight of my cufflinks reminded me that authority is often as much in appearance as it is in action. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Mr. Harrison? I did not expect to see you today." I smiled with quiet confidence. "I am here to review a few things." Her expression shifted from surprise to respect as she directed me to the conference room. Inside, Frank had already set up the documents, charts, and laptops. The room, bathed in soft light, seemed smaller now, yet powerful in its significance. I placed my briefcase on the table and ran my hand over the edge, feeling the grooves in the polished wood. "It is good to see you focused," Frank remarked. "I am ready," I said, my voice calm but filled with determination. I reviewed the figures, the ownership allocations, the agreements that had lain dormant for years. Each signature, each clause, now represented not just protection, but leverage, a testament to the foresight and discipline Susan and I had cultivated together. I instructed the assistant to prepare formal communications, and as I reviewed the drafts, the nameplates were updated to reflect my current authority: Chief Executive Officer, Harrison Logistics Group. Seeing my title displayed, crisp letters on polished metal, a wave of acknowledgement and satisfaction washed over me. Thomas called mid-afternoon. "I see your name finally in lights," he said, his voice carrying warmth and pride. I laughed softly. It was never about recognition. It is about reclaiming what was always mine. Later, I walked the floor, observing staff and managers who had long since respected me, but had deferred to Edward Langford's influence in my absence. I greeted them by name, discussed schedules and decisions, and made adjustments with subtle precision, each action reinforcing the authority I had quietly assumed without spectacle. A young project manager approached nervously, handing me a file labeled Strategic Expansion Proposal. "Mr. Harrison, your input is requested," she said. I took the folder, glanced through the plans, and offered a few pointed suggestions. Her eyes lit with understanding, and she nodded. "Understood. We will implement your recommendations immediately." I felt the familiar surge of satisfaction, not from obedience, but from effective leadership. In the late afternoon, Frank and I conducted a series of calls to partners and investors, each conversation beginning with the formal acknowledgement of my role. "Mr. Harrison, it is a pleasure to finally hear from you directly," one partner said, their voice now tinged with respect rather than casual dismissal. I guided discussions on asset allocation, growth strategies, and risk management with calm authority, aware that each decision carried implications far beyond this room. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I returned to the hotel, the same one where the previous chaos had made me feel invisible. The ocean glimmered in the fading light, reflecting a journey from isolation to command. I sat in the lounge, reviewing correspondence and emails from the morning, each marked with acknowledgement of my current position. Michael's phone call arrived, tentative, respectful. "Dad, I see now the influence you hold. I should have understood sooner." I smiled quietly. "Michael, focus on understanding what can be done next, not what was missed." Looking out the window toward the glittering shoreline, I realized that the authority I had reclaimed was more than a title. It was validation of experience, patience, and insight. The ballroom events of the previous day were no longer a place of embarrassment, but a reference point, a contrast highlighting the power I now held. The timeline of these events had returned to the present moment, and with it, a sense of clarity and readiness for what the next steps would demand. The horizon seemed wider, the possibilities more tangible, and I felt the steady assurance that the path forward was firmly in my hands, guided not by the whims of others, but by the disciplined understanding and strategic choices I had always maintained. I returned to Palm Beach the following afternoon, but this time everything felt different. The same streets, the same ocean breeze, the same luxury buildings stood exactly where they had been before, yet the balance of control had shifted completely. For the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to events. I was directing them. Frank sat beside me in the back seat as our car moved slowly through traffic. A leather portfolio rested on his lap. Inside were the documents that would answer questions no one had thought to ask. "Are you certain you want to do this today?" he asked quietly. I looked out the window toward the water. "No more delays." He nodded. "Then everyone is already assembled." The meeting had been scheduled under the pretense of discussing post-wedding business opportunities. Edward had arranged it himself, confident that he would leave with even greater influence than he already possessed. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. When we arrived at the private conference center, several luxury vehicles already filled the parking lot. Investors, advisors, attorneys, and family members had been arriving for nearly an hour. As I entered the lobby, conversations softened. Heads turned. Not dramatically, not enough to attract attention from an outsider, but enough for me to notice. The receptionist immediately stood. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison." Her tone carried respect that had been absent only days earlier. I thanked her and continued toward the elevator. On the 5th floor, the conference room doors remained closed. Through the frosted glass, I could see movement inside. Frank checked his watch. "Everyone is here." For a brief moment, I stood silently in the hallway. Not because I was nervous, because I was remembering. I remembered Susan. I remembered every long night building the company. Every sacrifice. Every decision made to protect the future. I remembered Michael learning how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. I remembered teaching him how to balance a checkbook at 16. I remembered believing that integrity would always matter more than appearances. Those memories grounded me. The doors opened. Inside, nearly 20 people sat around a polished conference table. Edward occupied the center position. Victoria sat beside Michael. Several board members were present. Financial advisors, attorneys, senior executives. The atmosphere was professional, but underneath it I could feel tension building like pressure beneath a sealed lid. Edward smiled confidently. "Richard, we were not expecting you." I returned the smile. "I know." Victoria exchanged a quick glance with her mother. Michael looked surprised but not alarmed. In fact, there was something else in his expression now. Curiosity, awareness, perhaps even hope. Frank took a seat beside me and placed the leather portfolio on the table. Nobody missed the gesture. Nobody ignored it. The room had changed. A week earlier, people might have dismissed my presence. Now every eye followed, even the smallest movement. Control had shifted without a single raised voice. Edward folded his hands. "Since we are all here, perhaps we should begin." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Before we discuss future opportunities, there are several ownership questions that need clarification." The sentence landed heavily. Victoria sat straighter. Patricia frowned slightly. Edward's confident smile weakened by a fraction. I remained silent. Another executive opened a folder. Some recently reviewed documents appear to contradict assumptions that have guided several major decisions. The room grew noticeably quieter. Michael slowly turned toward me. "Dad," he said carefully, "what exactly is happening?" I met his eyes. For the first time all weekend, I did not see distance between us. I saw uncertainty. I saw someone beginning to realize how little he truly knew about the foundation beneath his own life. Frank calmly opened the leather portfolio. One by one, documents appeared on the table. Trust agreements, governance records, ownership structures, signatures from years ago. Each page seemed to pull oxygen from the room. Edward's face lost color. Patricia stopped taking notes. Victoria's confidence faded into visible concern. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence became almost unbearable. I folded my hands and looked around the room. After years of assumptions, misunderstandings, and carefully crafted narratives, everyone was finally about to learn the truth. And just as Frank turned the first document toward the center of the table, the room held its breath. Frank carefully placed the first document in the center of the table, sliding it toward Edward. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood. "Edward," I began, my voice steady. "These documents outline the current ownership and decision-making authority of Harrison Logistics Group. The control you assumed was yours by default is, in fact, subject to agreements signed nearly 15 years ago." Edward blinked, swallowing as he tried to mask surprise. "That cannot be," he said, his tone measured but strained. I nodded toward the charts and contracts. "It is. Every signature, every clause, every contingency is valid and enforceable. The structure was designed to ensure the company could never be mismanaged, regardless of circumstances." Patricia leaned forward, her hands folded tightly. "Richard, what are you implying?" I held her gaze evenly. "I am saying that the assumptions made about my influence, or the lack thereof, have been incorrect. I have had the authority, quietly maintained, to ensure stability and proper governance. And now, those mechanisms are in effect." Victoria's eyes widened as she glanced between the papers, the realization slowly settling in. Michael's hand touched mine lightly, a silent acknowledgement that he now understood. One of the board members cleared his throat, looking around at the family. "This changes a number of current decisions." I allowed the moment to hang, letting the weight of the evidence sink into every corner of the room. Edward's smile faltered, and he exhaled slowly. "So all of the recent contracts, The agreements we have been acting upon, they were not final? I shook my head calmly. They were preliminary at best. The authority to execute or veto remained intact, and I have now exercised it according to the original framework. Michael swallowed, nodding slowly. I did not realize. Dad, you have been guiding all of this quietly. I inclined my head slightly. Guidance, protection, oversight. Not because of oversight by others, but because it was always my responsibility to maintain the integrity of the business. Victoria's voice was quiet, tinged with disbelief. But you did not intervene during the wedding, during our decisions? I kept my tone calm. Intervention is most effective when executed with precision. Timing matters more than immediate reaction. The room remained silent as the board members absorbed the scope of what had just been revealed. I continued, my gaze moving slowly from Edward to Patricia, then Victoria. Underestimating me was your mistake. Assumptions about control, authority, and influence were made based on appearances rather than structure. That error has now been corrected. Edward ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. Patricia's lips pressed together tightly, and Victoria's hands hovered above the table, frozen as comprehension settled. Michael finally spoke, his voice low. I never realized how much had been under your supervision, Dad. All these years, I was blind. I reached across the table, lightly touching his arm. Understanding comes with the right perspective. The truth is rarely obvious until someone takes the time to see it fully. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably, a quiet mingled with disbelief. Every person present could sense that the dynamic had changed irrevocably. Edward sat back slowly, the confident posture replaced by one of tentative recognition. Patricia's eyes met mine briefly, a mixture of respect and surprise. Victoria, still processing, whispered to Michael, I did not. I could not have imagined. I leaned back slightly, a calm smile forming as I observed the subtle tremor of realization wash over them. The room was no longer the same. The assumptions of power had been dismantled, and the full extent of my authority was now undeniable. And just as the weight of comprehension began to settle, the door to the conference room opened quietly, and another figure entered with a message that would deepen the shock, revealing that the ramifications of these revelations extended far beyond anyone in the room, including myself. As the last papers settled on the table, Edward finally exhaled and leaned back in his chair, the confidence that had dominated his posture now replaced with tentative awareness. I observed him quietly, my hands folded, my voice steady but calm as I addressed the room. The documents you have just seen reflect decisions made over a decade ago, executed with foresight and care to ensure the continuity and integrity of Harrison Logistics Group. Any assumptions of control you believe to hold were based on incomplete understanding. Patricia shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. Richard, she said carefully, you mean to say that everything we thought we could manage has already been under your direction? I nodded slowly. Exactly. Every major decision, every contingency plan, every safeguard you assumed you had influence over has been structured to operate with or without your involvement. That authority was established long before recent events and remains intact. Michael glanced at me, a mixture of relief and admiration crossing his face. I had no idea, Dad. I thought I was managing the company with some independence. I reached out briefly, resting a hand on his arm. You are capable, Michael, and you will manage it well. But never assume understanding without examining the facts. Victoria's lips pressed tightly together as she finally spoke. And all this time, you never intervened publicly? Never corrected anyone? I let a small, calm smile form. Intervention is most effective when timed precisely. Public confrontation would have only caused disruption. Private oversight ensures control while preserving stability. That is the difference between perception and authority. Edward ran a hand over his face, eyes darting across the room, taking in the reactions of the board members and executives who now sat with quiet deference, many recognizing the depth of preparation and foresight that had remained hidden. So, he said slowly, all the strategies, the meetings, the assumptions we made, they were miscalculated. I inclined my head. Not miscalculated, Edward. They were structured to maintain continuity and protect all stakeholders. What appeared to be gaps or weaknesses were, in reality, layers of preparation that you failed to perceive. Patricia exhaled, a low, measured sound. I suppose we underestimated the value of long-term planning and experience. I kept my tone even. Perhaps. It is easy to misinterpret visibility for influence. Just because authority is not vocal does not mean it is absent. The room remained quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of papers and the distant hum of air conditioning. Michael spoke again, more firmly this time. Dad, I see now that our assumptions about control were flawed. I should have trusted your guidance earlier. I nodded gently. Recognition is the first step. Moving forward, we act with understanding and respect for the structures that have sustained this company and family for decades. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. And what about us? What role do we play now? I met her gaze, steady and unwavering. Your role is determined by participation and comprehension, not by entitlement. Decisions must be made with full awareness of reality, not convenience or assumption. The tension in the room was tangible, a combination of respect, surprise, and the slow acceptance that the landscape of influence had irrevocably shifted. The executives were quiet, attentive, the family members subdued but alert, processing the implications. I allowed the moment to settle before speaking again. There is more to consider, and many decisions will require deliberation. But let this be clear. Boundaries have been established, authority has been exercised, and guidance will continue within these parameters. As I folded my hands and leaned back, the room absorbed the weight of the declaration. Edward's expression was unreadable, Patricia's fingers still tapped lightly, and Victoria's eyes reflected the quiet realization that nothing would be the same. Michael exhaled slowly, almost relieved, yet I sensed the undercurrent of tension, the acknowledgement that while clarity had been provided, the emotional reconciliation had not yet occurred, and the journey to true understanding was still unfolding before us. The days following the meeting passed in quiet reflection. I returned to my home office in Naples, the sunlight filtering gently through the blinds, illuminating the desk where Susan's photograph still sat beside the laptop. The house felt calmer now, a balance restored not by drama or confrontation, but by clarity and intention. Michael had begun to step into his own responsibilities with a newfound respect for the systems in place. And though Victoria and the Langford family were adjusting to the reality of events, I sensed that equilibrium, while imperfect, had been established. Sitting there, I realized the most important lessons were not about control or authority, but about boundaries, self-respect, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding your own worth. Life is often measured not by what others permit you to do, but by how fully you can honor yourself in the face of expectation and disappointment. I want to speak to you, to anyone out there who feels overlooked or diminished. Your value is not determined by the opinions of others. Protect your emotional space, guard your principles, and nurture the relationships that honor your presence. The world can be harsh, but when you listen to your intuition and trust in your own guidance, clarity and freedom follow. Take a moment each day to recognize the strength you hold, to acknowledge the wisdom you have gathered, and to act with intention rather than reaction. Financial decisions, emotional boundaries, and personal choices should reflect your insight, not the expectations imposed upon you. In this quiet morning light, I poured a cup of coffee, holding it between my hands as I reflected on the journey. I lifted the small compass Susan had given me years ago, a symbol of guidance and trust in the unseen path, and I felt grounded, knowing that intuition and patience had steered me through every challenge. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 74, and the core lesson I want to share with you is that recognizing your own worth and maintaining your integrity is the foundation for true resilience. As the sunlight touched the shelves lined with family albums and company awards, I allowed myself a slow, deep breath, appreciating the journey, the lessons learned, and the people who had grown alongside me. And while not every misunderstanding has been healed, and not every relationship fully reconciled, the clarity, strength, and self-assured calm I now feel is a testament to patience, foresight, and the willingness to act with deliberate purpose. The compass remained in my hand, a quiet reminder that direction and truth are internal, guided by faith in oneself and the subtle movements of the universe. I encourage you to take your own time, to observe, to act carefully, and to protect what is yours, your spirit, your values, and your sense of self. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you. May it remind you that you are not alone in navigating betrayal, disappointment, or uncertainty. As you reflect on these lessons, remember to honor your own path and prepare for the journeys that lie ahead. And if this story resonates, I invite you to comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories, where each tale will explore the subtle, powerful ways people reclaim their lives, rebuild their confidence, and learn to trust the guidance of their own hearts and the quiet wisdom of the world around them.